At the Tech Honors Gala, security said, "You're not on the list." My wife, the manager, smiled. "Tonight's for our representatives only." Even the intern who started 3 days ago had a +1. Then I saw my wife seated with her ex-lover, laughing. I opened my laptop, hit send, and said, "Check your email." I walked away as phones started ringing. You know that feeling when you're standing outside a building that costs more per square foot than your entire childhood home, and you can literally smell the wealth seeping through the marble walls? Yeah, that was me on a Friday night in downtown Seattle, clutching my laptop bag like it was a golden ticket to Willy Wonka's factory, except instead of chocolate, this place was serving up overpriced crab cakes and the kind of champagne that comes with its own pronunciation guide. The Tech Honors Gala, the event of the year. The place where innovation gets celebrated, egos get inflated, and apparently, the guy who actually built half the technology being honored gets told to kick rocks. I've been looking forward to this night for months, not because I'm the type who enjoys wearing a tie that feels like a noose or making small talk with venture capitalists who think disruption is a personality trait, but because for once, just once, I thought I'd get to see my work recognized. My framework, my code, my 3 years of late nights fueled by cold pizza and the naive belief that hard work actually matters in corporate America. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. The security guard at the entrance was the kind of guy who took his job way too seriously, like he was guarding Fort Knox instead of a hotel ballroom full of tech bros in expensive sneakers. He had one of those fancy tablets, the kind that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and he was scrolling through it with the intensity of someone defusing a bomb. I gave him my name, smiled politely, and waited for the magical moment when he'd nod and wave me through like a civilized human being. Instead, he squinted at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen, like he was trying to spot the difference in one of those puzzle games you find in the dentist's waiting room. "Sorry, sir," he said, with all the warmth of a DMV employee on their lunch break, "but you're not on the list." I blinked. Once. Twice. Surely I'd misheard him. Surely there was some mistake, some glitch in the matrix, some cosmic joke that would resolve itself in the next few seconds. "I'm sorry, what?" I said, keeping my voice steady even though my brain was already starting to short-circuit. "I built half the tech being honored in there tonight. Like, literally half. The emotion detection framework? The neural mapping algorithm? That's mine. I'm the guy. I'm the developer." He just stared at me with the kind of blank expression that suggested he'd been hired specifically for his ability to not give a single damn about anyone's feelings. "Sir, if you're not on the list, I can't let you in. Company policy." Company policy. Right. Because policies are always fair and logical and definitely not designed to protect people who don't deserve protection. I was about to launch into a full-blown explanation of exactly why I should be on that list when I heard it. The voice that would turn my entire evening from mildly frustrating to absolutely soul-crushing. "My husband's not on the list, Brandon," said Melissa, my wife of 5 years, the woman who promised to love and cherish me through sickness and health, for richer or poorer, apparently until I became inconvenient to her career trajectory. She appeared beside the security guard like some kind of corporate fairy godmother, except instead of granting wishes, she was actively destroying mine. She was wearing a dress that probably cost more than my car. A sleek, midnight blue number that hugged her curves and screamed, "I'm important and you're not." Her hair was styled in that effortless way that actually takes 2 hours and a professional, and she had that smile on her face. You know the one. The smile that says, "I'm about to ruin your day, but I'm going to look fantastic while doing it." "Tonight's for official representatives only," she continued, her voice dripping with the kind of sweetness that dentists warn you about. She wasn't even looking at me. She was addressing Brandon, the security guard, like I was just some random dude who'd wandered in from the street. "We have a very strict guest list for this event. I'm sure you understand." I stood there, frozen, trying to process what was happening. This was my wife, my partner, the person who was supposed to have my back, and she was actively blocking me from attending an event where my own work was being celebrated. It would have been funny if it wasn't so devastatingly pathetic. And then, just to add insult to injury, I watched as Trevor, the intern who'd literally started working at Neuralink 3 days ago and still couldn't figure out how to use the coffee machine without adult supervision, walked past me with a +1 on his arm and a mimosa in his hand, looking like he'd just won the lottery. He gave me this little apologetic shrug, like, "Sorry, man, I don't make the rules," and disappeared into the glittering chaos inside. I peered through the entrance, past the security checkpoint, into the grand ballroom where everyone who mattered was gathered. The chandeliers looked like they'd been stolen from a French palace. The tables were decorated with centerpieces that probably required a degree in floral arrangement. And there, at one of the front tables, seated in a position of honor like some kind of corporate royalty, was Melissa. My Melissa. Except she wasn't alone. Next to her, close enough that their shoulders were touching, was Landon Reeves, her ex-boyfriend from college, the company's newly appointed creative strategist, and the human embodiment of everything I'd learned to hate about the tech industry. They were laughing, actually laughing, like this was the funniest night of their lives. Like betrayal was an Olympic sport and they were going for gold. He leaned in and whispered something in her ear, and she threw her head back in that exaggerated way people do when they want everyone around them to know they're having an amazing time. It was a performance, and I was the only audience member not invited to watch from inside the theater. Something inside me snapped. Not in a dramatic, violent way. More like a switch flipping. A decision being made. I'd spent years playing by the rules, being the good employee, the supportive husband, the guy who didn't make waves. And where had it gotten me? Standing outside a party celebrating my own achievements while my wife flirted with her ex, and some intern named Trevor drank mimosas on my behalf. I pulled out my laptop, opened it right there in front of Brandon the security guard, logged into my email, and attached every single file I'd been saving for a moment just like this. Code repositories, timestamped documents, patent applications with my name on them, signed communications proving ownership, investor interest letters, 3 years of receipts showing exactly who built what and when. I typed out a subject line that was simple, professional, and absolutely devastating. Patent ownership clarification, urgent. Then I hit send to every executive, board member, investor, and tech journalist whose email I could find. CC'd the CEO. BCC'd a few media outlets for good measure. Check your email, I said to Brandon, even though he had nothing to do with any of this. Then I closed my laptop, turned around, and walked away as the first phone started ringing inside the ballroom, followed by another and another, until the whole place sounded like a call center during tax season. Revenge doesn't need fireworks. It just needs good Wi-Fi and a man who's finally had enough. Let's hit the rewind button for a second, because you're probably wondering how I ended up in a situation where my own wife blocked me from a tech gala like I was some kind of corporate restraining order. Trust me, I've been asking myself the same question for the past year. Usually around 3 in the morning, when sleep decides to take a vacation and anxiety decides to throw a rave in my brain. The thing is, you don't wake up one day and suddenly find yourself invisible. It's more like a slow fade, like those jeans you keep wearing until one day you realize they're basically see-through, and everyone's been too polite to mention it. 3 years ago, I joined Neuralink Systems with the kind of optimism usually reserved for lottery ticket buyers and people who think they can change their ex. I'd been recruited specifically to design their emotion detection framework, this cutting-edge AI system that could analyze human emotional responses in real time and adjust digital interfaces accordingly. Sounds fancy, right? It was fancy. It was the kind of technology that made venture capitalists salivate and tech journalists write articles with headlines like, "The future of human-computer interaction is here." Except when those articles got written, my name was usually buried somewhere around paragraph 7, right after they'd spent 6 paragraphs talking about the company's visionary leadership and innovative culture. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Melissa, back when I still thought we were building something together instead of her building a career on top of my corpse. We met at a tech conference in San Francisco, one of those events where everyone's wearing the same navy blazer and pretending to care about keynote speeches while actually just scanning the room for potential networking opportunities. She was working in event management for a startup that eventually imploded in spectacular fashion, and I was presenting a paper on neural networks that approximately 7 people attended. She sat in the front row, asked intelligent questions, and laughed at my terrible jokes about machine learning. I was hooked faster than a fish at an all-you-can-catch buffet. When Neuralink offered me the lead developer position, Melissa was right there cheering me on, telling me this was my big break, my chance to finally get recognized for my talents. 6 months later, when the company posted an opening for a senior event manager, she applied and got the job. We were both thrilled. Working at the same company, building our careers together, sharing the commute and the inside jokes about Gary from accounting, who microwaved fish every single day like he was personally trying to violate the Geneva Convention. It felt like we were living the dream, or at least the startup version of it, which involved less money and more free LaCroix than the actual dream probably should. The first year was good. Great, even. I'd come home buzzing with excitement about some breakthrough in the code, and Melissa would listen, ask questions, genuinely engage with what I was doing. She'd tell me about the corporate events she was planning, the sponsors she was courting, the logistics nightmares she was solving. We were a team. Partners. The kind of couple that other couples look at and think, yeah, they've got it figured out. Except we didn't have anything figured out, because somewhere around month 18, things started shifting. Subtle at first. Melissa began sitting in on more technical meetings, positioning herself as the liaison between the development team and the executive floor. She'd translate what I said into corporate speak, turning, "We need 3 more weeks to debug the neural pathways," into, "We're implementing a strategic quality assurance phase to ensure optimal product delivery." The executives loved her. She made complicated things sound simple and simple things sound important, which is basically the entire job description of middle management. At work, she started referring to me as our lead developer in this weird third-person way, like I was a resource rather than a person. "Our lead developer has some concerns about the timeline," she'd say in meetings, gesturing vaguely in my direction while making eye contact with everyone except me. "Our lead developer thinks we should prioritize the mobile interface." It was like being narrated by someone who'd forgotten I had a name and vocal cords. But that was nothing compared to how she talked to me at home. At home, I wasn't our lead developer. I was someone who doesn't understand aesthetics. When I suggested we didn't need to spend $800 on throw pillows that nobody was allowed to actually throw. I was not really a people person when I said I didn't want to attend her colleague's housewarming party, where I'd inevitably spend 3 hours making small talk about market disruption with people who thought I was her assistant. I was too focused on the technical details when I tried to explain why my framework was different from every other emotion detection system on the market. Melissa thrived in attention the way plants thrive in sunlight. She needed it, fed off it, couldn't function without it. Every company all-hands meeting was her personal TED Talk. Every client dinner was her chance to shine. Every corporate email was an opportunity to deploy her signature move, taking credit for ideas while making it sound like she was being humble about it. "The team did amazing work on this," she'd write, and everyone would assume she meant the development team, but really she meant herself and maybe Brad from marketing who brought donuts once. Meanwhile, I thrived in silence. Give me a quiet room, a working computer, and a problem to solve, and I was happy. I didn't need the spotlight. Didn't want it, honestly. I just wanted to build things that worked, that mattered, that made people's lives a little bit easier. I built the algorithms that made everything run. Melissa built the narrative that made everything sound impressive. And for a while, I convinced myself that was okay, that we were complementary, that relationships were all about balance and compromise and other things people say when they're trying to justify why they're accepting way less than they deserve. We were like a Ferrari with no brakes, which sounds exciting until you realize you're heading straight toward a cliff and the person in the driver's seat is too busy checking their makeup in the rearview mirror to notice. Everything looked perfect from the outside. Beautiful couple, successful careers, matching company badges. But inside, I was slowly disappearing, fading into the background of my own life like a supporting character who forgot he was supposed to be the protagonist. The worst part wasn't even the lack of recognition or appreciation. It was the way Melissa had convinced me that this was normal, that this was just how things worked in corporate America, that wanting credit for your own work was somehow petty or egotistical. She had a way of making me feel like I was being unreasonable for expecting basic respect, like I was the problem for caring about something as trivial as acknowledgement. I should have seen the red flags, should have recognized the pattern. Should have realized that someone who makes you feel invisible in private will eventually make you invisible in public. But love, or whatever I was calling it by that point, has a way of making you blind to things that everyone else can see from space. And by the time I finally started seeing clearly, I was already standing outside that gala, not on the list, watching my wife laugh with her ex while my work got celebrated without me. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to work in an office where your worst nightmare gets hired as your supervisor's favorite person, let me paint you a picture. His name was Landon Reeves, and he walked into Neuralink Systems like he was entering a movie premiere where he was both the star and the director. Melissa's ex-boyfriend from college. The guy she swore was ancient history and totally irrelevant to our lives. The same guy whose Instagram she definitely didn't check every 3 months, and whose name definitely didn't come up in conversations way more often than any ex-boyfriend's name should. Landon had one of those faces that looked like it had been focus grouped for maximum trustworthiness. Sharp jawline, perfectly maintained stubble that probably required a team of grooming specialists, and a smile that reminded me of what you'd see right before a used car salesman convinced you that a 2008 Honda Civic with 200,000 miles was actually a vintage collector's item. He wore expensive casual, which is that specific brand of clothing that costs more than formal wear, but looks like he just threw it on without thinking. A blazer over a t-shirt. Designer jeans that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Shoes that were somehow both sneakers and dress shoes, existing in that quantum state of footwear that only rich people understand. His official title was Head of Innovation, which is corporate speak for, we're not really sure what this person does, but they interview really well and went to the right schools. In practice, what Landon actually did was show up to meetings I'd been having for months, listen to ideas I'd been developing, nod thoughtfully like he was absorbing ancient wisdom, and then present those exact same ideas to executives 3 days later with slightly different terminology and significantly more confidence. The first time it happened, I thought it was a misunderstanding. We'd had this development meeting where I'd presented a prototype for emotional mapping in real-time video conferencing. The kind of thing that could detect when someone was losing interest in a Zoom call and adjust the presentation accordingly. I'd spent 6 weeks building it, testing it, refining it until it actually worked. The team was excited. Even Melissa seemed impressed, which was rare enough that I'd actually called my mom about it. 2 weeks later, Landon scheduled a presentation with our investors. Didn't tell me about it, didn't invite me, didn't even send a courtesy email that said, "Hey, I'm going to be talking about that thing you built." I found out because Derek from the QA team mentioned it in the break room while we were both waiting for the coffee machine to finish its interpretation of what coffee should taste like. "Dude, Landon's pitch was insane," Derek said, dumping his 4th packet of sugar into his cup. "That emotion mapping thing? The investors are throwing money at it." I stood there holding my empty mug, trying to process what I'd just heard. "The emotion mapping thing," I repeated slowly. "The prototype I presented 2 weeks ago?" Derek looked at me like I'd just asked if water was wet. "Yeah, man. Landon really knocked it out of the park. They're saying he might get VP tracked for this." VP tracked. For my work. My code. My idea. My 6 weeks of debugging and testing and refining. And Landon got to walk into a room, flash that dealership smile, and collect the applause like he'd invented fire instead of just stealing someone else's lighter. I went straight to Melissa's office, which was this glass-walled space that made her look important and made everyone else feel like they were interrupting something crucial. She was on her phone, probably scheduling another event where I wouldn't be invited, but she held up one finger in that universal gesture for, "I acknowledge your existence, but I'm too busy to care right now." When she finally hung up, I didn't even wait for her to ask what I wanted. Landon just pitched my prototype to investors. She didn't look surprised, didn't look concerned. She looked mildly annoyed that I was bothering her with this. "It's a company prototype," she said, like she was explaining basic math to a toddler. "It's not personal intellectual property. Everything developed here belongs to Neuralink." "I get that," I said, trying to keep my voice level even though I wanted to scream. But he didn't even mention my name. He presented it like he built it himself. Melissa sighed, one of those long, exhausted sighs that suggested I was the problem, not the guy literally stealing credit for my work. That's not how corporate presentations work. He was representing the company's achievements. It's a team effort. Team effort. Right. If team is defined as one person does all the work and another person gets all the credit, then sure, we were the best team in the history of collaborative enterprise. But it didn't stop there, because Landon wasn't just stealing my ideas. He was actively positioning himself as the genius behind everything innovative happening at Neuralink. He'd show up to my stand-up meetings, lean against the doorframe like he was too cool for chairs, and pepper me with questions that sounded supportive but were actually just intelligence-gathering missions. "Walk me through your thought process on the neural pathways," he'd say, and I'd explain it because I'm an idiot who still believed in things like teamwork and collaboration. Then he'd nod, say something like, "Fascinating approach," and disappear to go package my thought process into a PowerPoint that would make executives weep with joy. The worst part was watching Melissa's reaction to all of it. Every time Landon presented something, every time he got praised in an all-hands meeting, every time someone referred to him as a visionary, she'd light up like a kid on Christmas morning. She'd clap enthusiastically, lean forward in her seat, nod along like he was dropping profound wisdom instead of repackaged concepts he'd lifted from my Slack messages. I tried talking to HR about it once, which was like trying to report a crime to someone who's best friends with the criminal. Sandra from HR listened to my concerns with the kind of expression people have when they're pretending to care but are actually thinking about what they're going to have for lunch. "Neuralink values all contributions," she said, reading from what was obviously a script she'd memorized for situations exactly like this. "Our success is built on collaborative innovation and team-based achievement. It sounds like you and Landon are working together effectively to advance the company's mission." Working together. Sure. If you define working together as one person builds the car and the other person drives it to the dealership and sells it under their own name, then we were basically the poster children for collaboration. Meanwhile, Landon was collecting accolades like they were Pokemon cards. Rising Star Award at the quarterly meeting. Featured in the company newsletter with a headline that read, "Innovating Tomorrow, Today." A corner office with actual windows that looked out onto something other than the parking lot. And through it all, Melissa was right there beside him, managing events that celebrated his achievements, scheduling meetings that elevated his profile, making sure everyone knew that Landon Reeves was the future of Neuralink systems. That's when I started to realize that corporate life wasn't actually that different from high school. Same cliques, same popularity contests, same situation where the kid who copies your homework gets an A while you get accused of not being a team player. The only difference was that in high school, the worst that could happen was you didn't get invited to prom. In corporate America, the worst that could happen was you built something revolutionary and watched someone else get rich and famous from it while you got a thanks for your contribution, email, and a gift card to Applebee's. But I was learning. Slowly, painfully, like someone learning not to touch a hot stove by touching it repeatedly. I was learning that in this circus, being talented wasn't enough. Being right wasn't enough. Actually doing the work wasn't enough. What mattered was who told the best story, who smiled the brightest, and who had the right connections to the people who mattered. And Landon? He had the best story, the brightest smile, and a direct connection to my wife. You know how in horror movies there's always that moment where the music changes and you realize the protagonist is about to walk into something terrible, but they're too oblivious to notice? That was my life for about 6 months, except instead of ominous violin screeches, the soundtrack was Melissa's increasingly elaborate morning routine and the sound of her phone buzzing with messages she'd angle away from me whenever I walked into the room. It started small, the way betrayal usually does. Nobody wakes up and decides to nuke their marriage in a single day. It's more like erosion, like water slowly wearing away rock until one day you look down and realize you're standing on the edge of a cliff you didn't know existed. Melissa began dressing differently, trading her usual business casual. You know, the in-tailor suits and sensible heels that said, "I'm professional but approachable," for outfits that looked like they'd been curated by a personal stylist who charged by the hour and had opinions about power silhouettes. Suddenly, she was wearing these tailored dresses that probably cost more than our monthly grocery budget, the kind that required strategic Spanx deployment and made her look like she was about to close a deal on the cover of Fortune magazine. Her makeup routine went from 10 minutes to 45, involving products with names like Luminescent Dew Serum and high-impact micro-defining mascara that cost approximately $1 million per ounce. She bought new shoes, Louboutins with those signature red soles that apparently signify you've made it in life, or at least that you've made enough questionable financial decisions to pretend you've made it. I noticed, but didn't say anything. Because I'm an idiot who thought maybe she was just feeling good about herself, going through some kind of confidence renaissance, having a delayed quarter-life crisis that involved retail therapy instead of buying a motorcycle. I even complimented her once, said she looked great, asked if there was a special occasion. She'd looked at me like I'd just asked if the sun was planning to rise tomorrow. I'm a senior event manager, she said, applying lipstick in the hallway mirror like she was preparing for war. Image matters. You wouldn't understand. And there it was again, that casual dismissal, that gentle reminder that I existed somewhere beneath her on the corporate food chain, that my opinion on anything not involving code was essentially worthless. I should have said something, should have pushed back, should have asked why my understanding suddenly mattered so little to someone who used to value my perspective on everything from career decisions to whether we should get Thai food or pizza for dinner. But I didn't. Because that's what happens when someone spends years making you feel like you're being unreasonable for having perfectly reasonable expectations. You start second-guessing yourself. Start thinking maybe you are overreacting. Maybe you are being too sensitive. Maybe this is just what adult relationships look like when both people have demanding careers and complicated lives. Then came the late nights. Business trips. Always plural, always vague. Always with about 48 hours notice that made it impossible to question without sounding like a paranoid spouse from a daytime drama. Melissa would breeze through the door at 7 p.m., throw some clothes in a suitcase like she was playing Tetris on expert mode, and announce she had to fly to Portland or Austin or San Diego for a critical client meeting or an executive planning session or some other corporate justification that sounded official enough to be true. Who's going? I'd ask, trying to sound casual instead of desperately insecure. The usual team, she'd say, not looking at me, focused on her phone like it contained the secrets of the universe. Leadership level only. Landon's coordinating the innovation presentation. Landon, of course. Landon was always there, always coordinating, always presenting, always occupying space in my wife's schedule that used to be reserved for things like date nights and conversations about our future and pretending to care about each other's days. But sure, it was all professional, all above board, all perfectly normal that my wife was spending more time in hotels with her ex-boyfriend than she was spending in our apartment with her actual husband. I tried talking to her about it once, after a particularly long week where she'd been gone for 4 days and came back glowing like she'd been photoshopped by the universe itself. She looked happy, not just content or satisfied, but genuinely, radiantly happy in a way I hadn't seen in months, maybe years. And I realized with the kind of sinking dread usually reserved for dental appointments and tax audits that I wasn't the source of that happiness anymore. Might never have been. We need to talk, I said, which is universally recognized as the 4 worst words you can string together in a relationship. She looked up from her laptop, where she was probably scheduling another romantic business trip. About what? About us. About how we're barely seeing each other anymore. About how every time you come home from these trips, you seem more interested in your phone than in actually talking to me. She closed her laptop with the kind of deliberate slowness that signaled I'd just entered dangerous territory. I'm building my career, she said, enunciating each word like I was hard of hearing. I'm sorry if that's inconvenient for you, but some of us have ambitions beyond writing code in a dark room all day. Writing code in a dark room. That's what my work had become in her mind. Not developing revolutionary technology. Not creating frameworks that would change how humans interact with computers. Just writing code in a dark room, like some kind of digital hermit who'd chosen isolation over success. That's not fair, I said, hating how defensive I sounded. You know what's not fair? She shot back. Having a partner who doesn't understand that sometimes success requires sacrifice. That sometimes you have to prioritize work over personal convenience. Personal convenience. Our marriage had been demoted to personal convenience. Like I was upset about her forgetting to buy milk instead of barely existing in her life anymore. That conversation ended like most of our conversations ended those days, with Melissa retreating to her laptop and me retreating to my own thoughts, wondering when exactly I'd become the villain in my own marriage. Then came the announcement that would change everything, though I didn't know it yet. Melissa walked through the door one evening in late September, practically vibrating with excitement. Her face lit up like someone had just told her she'd won the lottery and inherited a castle in the same afternoon. She was carrying champagne, the expensive kind with the French name I couldn't pronounce, and 2 glasses. "They're giving us a presentation slot at the Tech Honors Gala," she announced, popping the cork with the kind of flourish usually reserved for New Year's Eve and marriage proposals. My heart jumped. Finally, after 3 years of grinding, of late nights, of building something that actually mattered, we were going to get recognized. Not just me, not just Melissa, but us, as a team, as partners, as people who'd worked together to create something meaningful. "Finally us," I said, grinning like an idiot, already mentally planning what I'd say in the presentation, how I'd explain the framework in a way that was accessible but still technically impressive. Melissa poured the champagne, handed me a glass, and that's when I saw it. That microsecond of hesitation, that brief flicker in her eyes that signaled bad news was coming wrapped in celebration. "Oh," she said, so casually it felt rehearsed. "You won't be attending. It's invitation only. Very exclusive. They're limiting it to senior leadership and key representatives." I laughed. Actually laughed out loud, because surely this was a joke. Surely my wife wasn't telling me that I wouldn't be attending an event where my own work was being presented. Surely we hadn't reached the point where the absurdity was this obvious, this blatant, this completely insane. But she wasn't laughing. She was sipping her champagne, checking her phone, already moving on to the next thing while I stood there holding my glass, watching my world tilt sideways. "You're serious," I said. "It's nothing personal," she replied, which is what people always say when something is extremely personal. "It's just how these events work. Limited capacity, strategic attendance. You understand." But I did understand. Finally, painfully, with the kind of clarity that only comes when you've been hit over the head with reality enough times that you can't pretend anymore. I understood that I wasn't her partner. I was her resource, her secret weapon, her backstage crew member who made the show possible but never got to take a bow. That night, after Melissa went to bed, I sat at my desk and started planning. Not the kind of planning where you hope things get better or convince yourself that communication will solve everything. The kind of planning where you realize you're done being invisible and it's time to become unforgettable. I started collecting receipts. Every email, every code commit, every Slack message, every document with my name on it. I organized them methodically, building a case file like I was preparing for trial. Because in a way I was. They wanted to celebrate my work without me? Fine. But they were going to learn that the show doesn't run without the person who built the stage. Here's what nobody tells you about revenge. It requires the organizational skills of a serial killer and the patience of someone waiting for customer service to pick up the phone. For 2 months, I became a digital hoarder with a purpose, collecting evidence like I was building a case for the world's most boring crime documentary. Every email where I'd outlined a feature got saved. Every Slack message where I'd solved a problem got archived. Every code commit with my name on it got timestamped and backed up in 3 different locations because I'm paranoid, but also because paranoia is just pattern recognition when you're surrounded by people who want to screw you over. I'm talking spreadsheets within spreadsheets, folders within folders, a whole organizational system that would make a CIA analyst weep with joy. I had everything categorized by project, by date, by level of damning evidence. There were the emails where Landon asked me to walk him through my approach, which was code for explain it so I can steal it. There were the meeting notes where I presented ideas that magically appeared in his investor pitches 3 weeks later with slightly different adjectives. There was even the Slack conversation where Melissa called my emotion detection framework a cute little project, which felt like a verbal pat on the head you'd give to a kindergartner who'd just shown you a drawing of what might be a dog or might be a potato. But collecting receipts was only half the battle. The other half was figuring out what to actually do with them, because sending angry emails to HR wasn't going to change anything except maybe get me labeled as difficult and quietly managed out of the company during the next restructuring. I needed a different approach. I needed leverage. I needed to build something they couldn't take from me, something that would make them realize exactly what they'd lost when they decided I was disposable. So I started working on my own version of the framework, except this time it was mine. Completely, legally, undeniably mine. I called it CentraMind, and I built it during every moment Melissa was on her business trips with Landon, which meant I had a lot of time. Turns out when your wife is barely home and you don't have a social life because you've spent 3 years dedicating yourself to a company that treats you like a printer, necessary but utterly replaceable. You have an abundance of free time to pour into passion projects that are definitely not just thinly veiled revenge schemes. CentraMind was everything Neuralink's framework wanted to be but couldn't achieve because it was being designed by committee and presented by people who didn't actually understand the technology. I stripped out all the bloat, refined the neural pathways, improved the response time by 30%, and added features that I'd been suggesting for months but kept getting shut down because they were too ambitious or not aligned with current strategic priorities, which is corporate speak for, we don't understand what you're talking about, so we're going to pretend it's not important. I worked on it obsessively, the way people work on anything when it's the only thing keeping them from completely losing their minds. My apartment became a disaster zone of empty coffee cups, pizza boxes, and sticky notes covered in algorithm sketches that probably looked like the scribblings of a beautiful mind slowly deteriorating. I stopped sleeping normal hours, stopped pretending to care about Neuralink's daily stand-ups, stopped investing emotional energy in a marriage that had clearly ended months ago, even though nobody had bothered to officially pronounce it dead. And then I met Ingrid Rouse, who would turn out to be either my guardian angel or my partner in corporate terrorism, depending on how you looked at it. I'd cold emailed about 50 venture capitalists, most of whom either ignored me or sent back those automated responses that are basically the professional equivalent of new phone who dis. But Ingrid actually responded, and not with some assistant-filtered brush-off. She sent me a 2-line email that said, "Your pitch doesn't suck. Coffee tomorrow at 10. Don't be boring." Ingrid was not what I expected from a venture capitalist, which I guess made sense because she was successful and most of my expectations came from watching Silicon Valley and assuming everyone in that world was either a sociopath or a moron or both. She was probably in her mid-50s. With gray hair, she didn't bother dyeing and glasses that looked like they'd cost more than most people's monthly rent, but were somehow also practical. She didn't dress like she was trying to impress anyone. Just jeans and a blazer that had definitely seen better days, but somehow looked more expensive because of it. We met at this coffee shop in Capitol Hill that served pour-over coffee with the kind of pretentious ceremony usually reserved for religious rituals. She ordered black coffee. I ordered something with too many words in its name, and we sat down at a corner table where she proceeded to grill me like I was a suspect in a crime I didn't know I'd committed. "Walk me through CentraMind," she said, not bothering with small talk or pleasantries, or any of the social lubrication that normal people use when meeting strangers. "And don't give me the elevator pitch. Give me the real version. The one where you explain why this actually matters and not just why it's." Sounds cool. So I did. I explained the neural mapping, the emotion detection algorithms, the real-time adaptation capabilities, the potential applications in everything from mental health support to customer service optimization to educational tools for kids with learning disabilities. I showed her my prototype, demonstrated how it worked, walked her through the technical architecture while she nodded, and asked questions that proved she actually understood what I was talking about, which was so refreshing I almost cried into my overpriced latte. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with the kind of look that suggested she was calculating something I couldn't see. "You're not asking for funding," she said finally. "You're asking for payback." I didn't deny it. What would be the point? She clearly saw right through whatever professional veneer I was attempting to maintain. "Is that a problem?" She smiled, and it wasn't a warm smile or a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who'd been in the business world long enough to know that revenge was often the best motivator for building something great. "Hell no," she said. "The best founders I've ever funded were running on spite and caffeine. Passion fades. Revenge is forever." We talked for 3 hours. She told me about her portfolio, about the companies she'd backed, about the ones that succeeded and the ones that imploded spectacularly. She asked about Neuralink, about Melissa, about Landon, and I found myself telling her everything. Not because I wanted to trauma dump on a stranger, but because she asked questions like she actually cared about the answers instead of just waiting for her turn to talk. "Here's what I'm going to do," she said when we finally wrapped up. "I'm going to wire you seed funding. Not a massive amount. You don't need massive yet. You need enough to build a real prototype, get some beta testers, prove the concept works outside of your apartment. Then we'll talk Series A." I stared at her, waiting for the catch, because there's always a catch. Nobody just hands you money without wanting something in return that will eventually destroy your soul or your company or both. What's the equity split? I asked. Standard seed terms. I'll send the paperwork. But here's the real deal. I want weekly updates. I want to know what's working, what's failing, what problems you're hitting. And I want complete honesty. You bullshit me, we're done. You hide problems, we're done. You try to spin failure as learning opportunity, we're done. Got it. I got it. She wired me the money the next week. Not life-changing money, but enough to quit my job if I wanted to, enough to hire a small team, enough to turn Centramind from a revenge fantasy into an actual company. I didn't quit Neuralink though, not yet. I wanted to be there for the gala. Wanted to see their faces when everything came crashing down. Wanted to be present for the finale of a show I'd been writing for 2 months. I named my new company Neuroforge because I was done building for other people's applause, and because it sounded cool, and because screw them, I earned the right to name things whatever I wanted. Started setting up the infrastructure, the legal entity, the bank accounts, all the boring administrative stuff that makes a revenge plot feel less like Ocean's 11 and more like filing taxes. But every time I looked at that company registration document with my name on it, not as an employee, not as a resource, but as a founder, I smiled. Because I wasn't invisible anymore. I was building something they couldn't take away, couldn't steal, couldn't claim as their own team effort. The gala was 3 weeks away. My inbox bomb was armed and ready. And I was about to teach Neuralink Systems the most expensive lesson they'd ever learn. Never underestimate the guy you treated like he didn't matter. So there I was, standing outside the Fairmont Olympic Hotel on a Friday night in October, dressed in the only suit I owned that didn't make me look like I was attending my own funeral, holding my laptop like it was the nuclear briefcase, and I was about to launch World War III, except instead of missiles I had receipts, and instead of casualties there would just be a lot of very uncomfortable executives scrambling to explain themselves to angry investors. The universe has a funny sense of timing, doesn't it? 3 years of invisible labor, 3 years of watching other people take credit for my work, 3 years of slowly disappearing in my own marriage, and it all came down to this moment. Me versus a security guard named Brandon, who looked like he bench-pressed protein powder for fun. You're not on the list, Brandon had said, like he was reading my death sentence off a teleprompter. And then Melissa appeared, my wife, my partner, the woman who'd promised to build a life with me, but apparently meant she'd build a life on top of my demolished dreams. She was wearing that midnight blue dress that probably cost more than 3 months of our rent, looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread titled, Women Who've Successfully Gaslit Their Husbands into Oblivion. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was flawless. She looked like success personified, and I looked like the guy who'd been specifically uninvited to witness it. My husband's not on the list, Brandon, she'd said. And I swear I saw Brandon flinch slightly. Like even he recognized how brutal it was to hear your own wife refer to you in the third person while actively blocking you from entering a building. Tonight's for official representatives only. Official representatives. I was the lead developer. I'd built half the technology being celebrated inside that ballroom. But sure, I wasn't an official representative. I was just the person who'd made everything possible, which apparently didn't qualify me for a seat at the table or even a spot near the door. And then Trevor walked by. Trevor, who'd been hired 72 hours ago and still needed help logging into his email, with a date and a mimosa, looking like he'd won a golden ticket to Willy Wonka's factory, except this factory produced quarterly earnings reports and existential dread instead of chocolate. He gave me this apologetic shrug that said, "Sorry, man, but I'm not going to sacrifice my mimosa access to stand in solidarity with you," and disappeared into the warmth and light while I stood there in the cold, metaphorically and literally. I peered through the entrance, past Brandon's judgmental shoulder, into the ballroom that looked like someone had robbed Versailles and reassembled it in Seattle. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks. Tables were draped in linens that probably had a higher thread count than my actual sheets at home. And there, positioned at a table near the front like corporate royalty, sat Melissa next to Landon Reeves, her ex-boyfriend, the human embodiment of everything wrong with the tech industry. Both of them laughing like they were auditioning for a romantic comedy, except the joke was my entire professional existence. Landon leaned in and whispered something in her ear. She threw her head back and laughed with the kind of exaggerated enthusiasm that made it clear this wasn't just about whatever hilarious thing he'd said. This was a performance, a statement, a middle finger disguised as a social interaction. They looked happy. They looked comfortable. They looked like two people who'd successfully conspired to erase someone from their own success story and were now celebrating their achievement with overpriced wine and catered hors d'oeuvres. Something inside me clicked, not snapped. Clicking suggests precision, intentionality, the sound of a mechanism engaging exactly as designed. I'd been building toward this moment for 2 months, collecting evidence like a digital detective, organizing files like an obsessive-compulsive librarian, preparing for the exact scenario that was unfolding in front of me. This wasn't emotional impulse. This was calculated execution. This was checkmate announced 3 moves before it happened. I pulled out my laptop right there on the sidewalk, opened it with the kind of casual confidence usually reserved for action movie heroes disarming bombs, and logged into my email. Brandon was watching me like I might be having some kind of public breakdown, which was fair because to outside observers, I probably looked like a guy who'd been rejected from a party and was now checking his email as some kind of sad consolation prize. But I wasn't checking email. I was sending it. I'd spent weeks crafting this message. The subject line alone had gone through 17 revisions before I settled on something that was professional, urgent, and vague enough to guarantee every recipient would open it immediately out of pure curiosity and mild panic. Patent ownership clarification, urgent. Not threatening, not accusatory, just informative in that way that makes lawyers nervous and executives reach for antacids. The email itself was a masterpiece of documentation. I'd attached code repositories with timestamps showing exactly when each piece of the framework had been developed and by whom. Patent applications with my name on them, filed independently before Neuralink had even thought to claim ownership. Signed communications proving that I'd presented ideas months before they appeared in anyone else's pitch decks. Investor interest letters for CentraMind that demonstrated the technology worked independently of Neuralink's infrastructure. 3 years of receipts proving that while Landon had been presenting, I'd been building, and the people inside that ballroom had been celebrating stolen valor. I'd CC'd everyone who mattered, the CEO, the board of directors, the investors who'd shown up tonight expecting to celebrate innovation. I'd BCC'd a few tech journalists I'd connected with over the years, the ones who wrote articles about corporate ethics and intellectual property theft and loved nothing more than a good David versus Goliath story where David had documentation. I'd even included legal counsel in the loop, just to make it extra spicy, just to ensure that everyone understood this wasn't a disgruntled employee venting frustration. This was a formal challenge backed by evidence that could survive scrutiny. My finger hovered over the send button for approximately half a second. Not because I was hesitating or second-guessing or experiencing some last-minute attack of conscience. I just wanted to appreciate the moment, to acknowledge that I was about to detonate a bomb that would reshape everything. To recognize that the person I'd been 3 years ago, the optimistic developer who believed hard work mattered more than politics, was officially dead, and someone new was being born right here on this sidewalk. I clicked send. Check your email, I said to Brandon, even though he had absolutely nothing to do with any of this and was just a security guard trying to do his job. But I needed to say it out loud, needed to mark the moment with words, needed to transform this from silent revenge into declared war. Then I closed my laptop, turned around, and started walking toward the parking garage while behind me, inside that ballroom, phones started ringing. First one, then another, then a whole symphony of notification sounds, dings and buzzes and vibrations, creating a chorus of incoming panic that was probably the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. I didn't run, didn't rush. Just walked with the kind of calm purpose you see in movies when the hero walks away from an explosion without looking back, because looking back would ruin the moment. Except my explosion was digital, my casualties were reputations, and my victory lap was a 3-year-old Honda Civic that needed an oil change. My phone started blowing up before I even reached my car. Melissa calling, Landon calling, someone from HR calling, the CEO calling, even Victor Hale, the senior director who'd never bothered to learn my name despite 3 years of working in the same building, was suddenly very interested in having a conversation. My phone was lighting up like a Christmas tree on steroids. vibrating so hard it nearly jumped out of my pocket and made a run for freedom. I silenced it. All of it. Every call, every notification, every desperate attempt to reach me before I could do more damage or say something to the press, or generally make the situation worse for people who absolutely deserved to have the situation get worse. I'd spent 3 years being available 24/7, responding to Slack messages at 2 in the morning, fixing bugs during my lunch break, being the reliable guy who always answered when they called. Not anymore. I got in my car, started the engine, and smiled at my reflection in the rearview mirror. Not a bitter smile, or an angry smile, or even a triumphant smile. Just satisfied. The smile of someone who'd finally stopped being invisible and had become unforgettable in the most spectacular way possible. Revenge doesn't need fireworks or dramatic speeches or movie-worthy one-liners. It just needs good documentation, solid evidence, and a willingness to press send when everyone assumes you're too nice, too compliant, too invested in being liked to actually fight back. I drove home through the Seattle rain, windshield wipers keeping rhythm with my thoughts, phone still buzzing uselessly in the cup holder, and thought about what Ingrid had said. Revenge is forever. She was right. But what she didn't mention was how good it feels. The thing about dropping a corporate nuclear bomb is that the fallout takes a few days to really settle in, kind of like how you don't immediately feel that sketchy gas station sushi, but you know it's coming for you eventually. I spent the weekend ignoring approximately 200 phone calls, 400 text messages, and what I can only assume was a carrier pigeon that somehow got my address, because there was a very confused bird hanging around my apartment balcony that seemed unusually persistent. My phone had basically become a vibrating brick of corporate panic, and I'd never felt more zen in my entire life. Monday morning, I woke up to an email from Victor Hale, Senior Director of Product Development, and the kind of guy who thought synergy was a real word that meant something. Victor was one of those executives who'd perfected the art of looking important while doing absolutely nothing. He wore expensive suits, spoke in corporate buzzwords, and had somehow convinced everyone that his primary contribution to the company was strategic vision, which as far as I could tell meant he showed up to meetings, nodded thoughtfully, and collected a salary that could have funded a small country's education system. The email was professionally worded but reeked of desperation underneath all the formal language. I'd appreciate the opportunity to discuss recent developments in a professional setting. Perhaps we could meet for coffee. Coffee. Like we were old friends catching up instead of a company scrambling to do damage control after realizing they'd been celebrating stolen intellectual property at a gala that cost more than most people's annual salary. I wrote back with a time and place, a coffee shop in Fremont, far enough from Neuralink's offices that he'd have to actually make an effort, neutral territory where neither of us had home field advantage. I showed up 15 minutes late because punctuality is for people who still care about making good impressions, and I was officially done with that particular form of self-torture. Victor was already there, sitting at a corner table with a coffee that probably had more syllables in its name than my entire morning vocabulary. He looked tired, which made sense because I'd single-handedly ruined what was supposed to be the company's biggest PR victory of the year and turned it into a legal nightmare that would probably be discussed in business school ethics classes for the next decade. He'd loosened his tie slightly, which for a guy like Victor was the equivalent of showing up in pajamas, a clear sign that things were not going according to plan. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, standing up to shake my hand like we were conducting normal business instead of negotiating the terms of his company's surrender. His handshake was firm but sweaty, the grip of a man trying to project confidence while internally screaming. "Figured I owed you at least a conversation before my lawyers start having conversations with your lawyers," I said, sitting down and immediately regretting it because the chair was one of those hipster wooden things designed more for aesthetic than actual human comfort. Though to be fair, my lawyers are way more fun at parties. He didn't laugh. Corporate types never laugh at jokes that remind them they're in legal trouble. Instead, he slid a folder across the table, the kind of official-looking folder that usually contains either very good news or very bad news, and in my experience with Neuralink, it was never the former. "We'd like to acquire your framework," he said, cutting straight to the point because apparently we were skipping the part where he pretended to care about how I was doing or made small talk about the weather. "We're prepared to offer you a senior position. Triple your current salary, full credit on all documentation, your name on every patent application, complete creative control over development. I opened the folder and looked at the contract, which was honestly impressive in its desperation. They were offering me enough money to make my mother cry happy tears and call all her friends to brag. They were offering me the kind of title that came with actual windows in my office and probably a parking spot that wasn't next to the dumpster. They were offering me everything I'd wanted 3 years ago when I first joined the company, full of naive optimism and the mistaken belief that merit mattered. And Melissa? I asked, because I knew that was part of the deal even if it wasn't explicitly written in the contract. Corporate negotiations are like poker. Half the game is reading what's not being said. Victor shifted uncomfortably, the kind of shift that suggested he'd really hoped I wouldn't ask that question but had prepared an answer anyway. She'll be moved to internal operations. A lateral transition, really. Still valuable to the company, just in a different capacity. I almost laughed. Internal operations was corporate speak for, we're putting you somewhere you can't do damage, but we're not technically firing you, so please don't sue us. It was the professional equivalent of being sent to sit in the corner and think about what you'd done. From senior event manager hobnobbing with executives and planning galas to internal operations, which probably involved scheduling conference rooms and ordering office supplies. From the penthouse to the basement, but with the same salary, so it looked like a choice instead of a punishment. So, basically from manager to mailroom, I said, stirring my coffee even though I hadn't added anything that needed stirring. That's pretty harsh, Victor. I'm almost impressed by how vindictive that is while still maintaining plausible deniability. He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, though whether it was genuine discomfort or just more corporate theater was impossible to tell. We value Melissa's contributions, but there need to be consequences for professional oversights. Professional oversights. That's what we were calling it now. Not theft, not betrayal, not actively conspiring to erase someone from their own achievements. Just professional oversights, like she'd accidentally sent an email to the wrong recipient instead of deliberately blocking her own husband from an event celebrating his work. And Landon? I asked, because I wanted to hear them say it. Mr. Reeves' contract has been terminated effective immediately, Victor said, and I could tell he'd practiced that line in the mirror to get the tone exactly right. Serious, but not apologetic. Final, but not emotional. We discovered several irregularities in his project attributions that raised concerns about his professional conduct. Irregularities. What a beautiful word for he stole everything and we just figured it out because someone sent us receipts. Landon was gone, probably already updating his LinkedIn with some vague description about pursuing new opportunities, while frantically calling every contact in his phone trying to find another company he could charm his way into before word spread about why he'd really been fired. I looked at the contract again, at the salary that would have changed my life, at the title that would have made my parents finally understand what I did for a living, at all the things I desperately wanted back when I still believed that Neuralink was where I belonged. And then I thought about Ingrid, about Neuroforge, about the team I was building with people who'd also been overlooked and underestimated and told they didn't matter enough to get credit for their own work. This is tempting, Victor, I said, closing the folder and sliding it back across the table like I was returning a library book I'd finished reading. Really tempting. That salary number is particularly impressive. You guys must be really scared about how this looks to investors. He didn't confirm or deny, just watch me with the kind of careful expression people use when they're trying to figure out if you're bluffing or actually holding the cards you claim to have. But here's the thing. I continued, leaning back in my uncomfortable hipster chair and deciding to just commit to the discomfort. You had your chance to offer me this 3 years ago. Hell, you had your chance to offer me basic recognition, basic respect, basic acknowledgement that I was a human being who contributed something valuable. Instead, you let Melissa and Landon turn me into furniture. Useful furniture, sure, but still just something that existed to support other people while staying silent and invisible. That was a failure of management, Victor said, deploying what was clearly a pre-prepared talking point. We recognize that now, and we want to make it right. You want to make it right, or you want to make it go away? I asked. Because those are two very different things, Victor. Making it right would have been stopping it when it was happening. Making it go away is offering me money to shut up now that I've made it inconvenient for you. He didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. So here's my counteroffer, I said, standing up because I was done with this conversation and my back was legitimately starting to hurt from that terrible chair. I'm going to take Neuroforge and turn it into everything Neuralink could have been if you guys weren't so busy playing corporate politics that you forgot to actually care about innovation. And every time you see my company's name in the news, every time we land a client you were courting, every time we do something genuinely innovative instead of just claiming we're innovative in press releases, you're going to remember that you had a chance to keep me and you chose photo ops with Landon instead. I walked out of that coffee shop feeling lighter than I had in years, leaving Victor sitting there with his cold coffee and his rejected contract and probably a very uncomfortable call to make to his bosses about how the negotiation had gone. My phone rang before I even made it to my car. Melissa, calling for probably the 50th time since Friday night. This time, I answered. "They're firing Landon," she said immediately, her voice thick with tears. No hello or preamble or acknowledgement that maybe she owed me literally any kind of apology. "You destroyed everything. His career is over. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I sat in my car, key in the ignition but not starting it yet, listening to my wife cry about another man's career while showing zero concern for what she'd done to mine. "Correction," I said calmly. "I rebuilt everything. You just lost your subscription to the service." Then I hung up, blocked her number, and drove to my Neuroforge office, where people who actually valued my work were waiting. You ever notice how the best teams are built from people who've been kicked in the teeth by life and decided to start kicking back? That's exactly what Neuroforge became. Not a company built on business school theories and venture capital buzzwords, but a collection of talented people who'd been told they weren't good enough for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with their actual abilities and everything to do with corporate America's bizarre obsession with rewarding confidence over competence. Our office was a converted loft in Georgetown, the kind of space that real estate agents describe as charming and full of character, which is code for the heating doesn't work properly, and there might be rats, but the exposed brick looks great in photos. It was 3,000 square feet of raw potential and questionable electrical wiring, with windows that actually opened. A revolutionary concept after years of working in Neuralink's hermetically sealed corporate tomb, where the temperature was always exactly 72 degrees, and the air always smelled vaguely of ambition and disappointment. We didn't have Herman Miller chairs that cost more than used cars. We had mismatched furniture I'd bought off Craigslist from people who were either moving or going through divorces, which meant everything came with stories I didn't ask for, but got anyway. Our conference table was a door I'd mounted on sawhorses. Our whiteboard was literally just white paint on the wall that we could write on with dry erase markers. Our coffee situation was a Mr. Coffee machine that had seen better days and made beverages that tasted like regret and determination in equal measure. But here's the thing about not having fancy stuff. It meant everyone who showed up actually wanted to be there for the work, not for the Instagram-worthy office aesthetic or the free kombucha on tap or the ping pong table that nobody ever used, because who has time for ping pong when there's actual work to do? First person I hired was Ravi Patel, a back-end genius from Mumbai via Boston who'd been fired from his last job at a major tech company for not fitting the culture, which apparently meant he didn't smile enough during meetings. I'd found him through a developer forum where he'd posted some absolutely brilliant solutions to database optimization problems that made my brain happy in the way that only elegant code can. We met for coffee, and within 10 minutes I knew he was exactly who I needed. "They told me I needed to be more enthusiastic in stand-ups," Ravi said, stirring his chai with the kind of resigned frustration I recognized immediately. I said I was enthusiastic about the code, just not about performing enthusiasm for managers who don't understand what the code does. Apparently, that was the wrong answer. "Sounds like you dodged a bullet," I told him. "How do you feel about working somewhere that cares more about what you build than how much you smile while building it?" He smiled then, not a performance smile, not a corporate-pleasing smile, but a genuine expression of relief. "When can I start?" Next was Claire Morrison, a UX designer who'd been told at her previous company to make the interface more feminine, which is something that sounds ridiculous until you realize that someone with an MBA and decision-making authority actually said it in a meeting and expected it to be taken seriously. Claire had this portfolio that made me want to weep with joy: clean, intuitive interfaces that prioritized user experience over looking pretty, designs that actually solved problems instead of just winning awards for aesthetic innovation. I kept trying to explain that good design is gender neutral. Claire told me during her interview, which we conducted sitting on the floor of the empty loft because I hadn't bought furniture yet, that users don't care if something is masculine or feminine, they care if it works. But every suggestion got filtered through this lens of would a woman like this? As if women are some alien species that needs special color-coded interfaces. How do you feel about designing for humans instead of demographics? I asked. She grinned. Like I've been waiting my whole career for someone to ask me that question. Then there was Jules Kowalski, who technically was an intern except he knew more about front-end development than most senior developers I'd worked with. Jules had done the college thing for 2 years, decided it was a waste of time and money, taught himself to code using YouTube tutorials and sheer stubborn determination, and had been bouncing around various companies trying to prove that he was capable despite not having that magical piece of paper that costs $100,000 and proves you can regurgitate information on tests. Every place I work, I start as an intern, do the work of a senior developer, and then when I ask about advancement they tell me I need to finish my degree first, Jules explained, hunched over his laptop in our first team meeting. He was 22, dressed like he'd gotten his entire wardrobe from a charity shop that specialized in band t-shirts, and had the kind of enthusiasm that only comes from finally finding people who care about skills instead of credentials. It's like they can't process that someone without a degree might actually know what they're doing. We don't care about degrees here, I told him. We care about code quality, problem-solving ability, and whether you can admit when you don't know something instead of pretending you're an expert at everything. So I'm not an intern? He asked, looking genuinely confused. You're a front-end developer, I said, with a salary that reflects that title. Welcome to Neuroforge. We added 3 more people over the next month. Marcus, a project manager who'd been pushed out of his last job for not being aggressive enough, which apparently meant he treated people like humans instead of resources to be optimized. Yuki, a data scientist who'd been told she was too detail-oriented, which is possibly the stupidest criticism I'd ever heard for someone whose entire job was paying attention to details. And Ahmed, a network security specialist who'd been let go during a restructuring that eliminated his entire department and then hired contractors to do the same work at twice the price. None of us were bitter. Okay, that's a lie. We were all extremely bitter, but we channeled that bitterness into something productive instead of just complaining about it on LinkedIn while hunting for the next company that would eventually disappoint us. We were the island of misfit toys, except instead of toys we were developers, and instead of being misfit we were just competent people who'd been evaluated by incompetent managers. Our first client was a mid-sized healthcare company that needed help with their patient interface system. They'd been quoted $150,000 by a major consulting firm for a solution that would take 6 months and probably not work. We bid $40,000 in 3 months, which made them suspicious because apparently in corporate America, if something costs less it must be worse. Claire designed the interface in 2 weeks. Ravi built the backend in 3. Jules created a front end that was so smooth and intuitive that the client CEO called me personally to ask if we'd somehow stolen it from someone else, because there was no way we'd built something that good that fast. We integrated CentraMind's emotion detection framework, which meant the system could adapt to users who were stressed or confused and automatically simplify the interface or provide additional help. The demo day was one of those moments that reminds you why you got into this industry in the first place. We set up in the client's conference room. All 7 of us crammed around a table, running on coffee and the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing you've built something great, but having no idea if anyone else will recognize it. Marcus walked them through the features. Claire explained the design philosophy. Ravi demonstrated the back-end efficiency. And then we showed them the real-time analytics showing a 40% improvement in user task completion and a 60% reduction in support tickets. The room went quiet. Then the CEO started laughing. Not mocking laughter, but the kind of delighted laughter that comes from watching something exceed your expectations so thoroughly that you can't quite believe it's real. This is better than anything I've seen from companies 10 times your size, she said. How did you do this? I looked around at my team, at Ravi who didn't smile enough, at Claire who apparently designed too gender neutrally, at Jules who lacked the proper credentials, at Marcus who wasn't aggressive enough, at Yuki who paid too much attention to details, at Ahmed who'd been considered expendable. I looked at these people who'd been told they weren't good enough and had responded by building something extraordinary. We hired people who actually know what they're doing, I said. Revolutionary concept, I know. That night, we celebrated in the loft with pizza and cheap beer because we still couldn't afford the fancy stuff and honestly didn't want it. We sat on our mismatched furniture, ate from paper plates, and talked about the next project, the next client, the next problem we could solve. Somewhere during that conversation, probably around my third beer, I realized something that should have been obvious but somehow wasn't. Revenge had gotten me here. The anger at being invisible, the frustration at being overlooked, the determination to prove everyone wrong had been the fuel that started Neuroforge. But revenge wasn't going to sustain us. Revenge burns hot and fast and eventually consumes itself. What would keep us going was purpose. The knowledge that we were building something that actually mattered, that helped people, that made the world slightly less frustrating for users who just wanted technology to work without requiring a PhD to understand it. We were creating a place where talented people could do their best work without having to perform corporate theater or pretend to care about synergy or smile on command. Revenge got me here, but purpose would keep me here. And honestly, purpose felt a whole lot better than anger ever did. If you've never been sued by your former employer for allegedly stealing work that you actually created, let me tell you. It's a uniquely surreal experience, kind of like being accused of robbing your own house, while the actual burglars stand next to you pointing fingers and looking concerned. About a month after the Gallo incident, after Neuroforge had landed its first major client, and I was finally starting to believe that maybe I could build something sustainable instead of just an elaborate revenge plot with a business license, I got served with legal papers at my apartment by a guy who looked deeply apologetic about his job choice. "You've been served," he said, handing me a manila envelope that felt heavier than it should have, probably because it was full of accusations and corporate desperation. "Sorry, man. You seem like a nice guy." "Thanks," I said, taking the envelope. "You seem like you need a hug and possibly a career counselor." The lawsuit was a masterpiece of legal fiction, the kind of document that gets written when lawyers are given a losing case and a billable hour quota. Neuralink Systems was claiming that I'd stolen proprietary technology, violated my employment contract, breached confidentiality agreements, and basically committed every corporate crime short of embezzlement and arson. They wanted damages. They wanted injunctions. They wanted me to stop using CentraMind immediately and hand over all related materials like I was a pirate who'd stolen their treasure map, instead of a developer who'd built something with my own brain and my own time. The complaint was 63 pages long, which seemed excessive for what basically amounted to this employee had the audacity to be competent and then leave. I read through it while eating leftover pizza at my desk, highlighting the particularly ridiculous parts, which turned out to be most of it. My favorite section was page 37, where they claimed I'd used company resources to develop CentraMind, and their evidence was that I'd occasionally worked late at the office and therefore must have been secretly building my own company on their time. By that logic, everyone who's ever responded to a personal email at work is guilty of corporate espionage. I forwarded the lawsuit to my legal team, which consisted of two lawyers Ingrid had recommended, Sandra Chun and Marcus Webb, a duo who looked like they should be hosting a legal podcast about corporate absurdity instead of actually practicing law. Sandra was probably 5'2" in heels, had a collection of blazers in every color of the rainbow, and the kind of sharp intelligence that made opposing counsel visibly uncomfortable. Marcus was her opposite, 6'4", perpetually dressed like he was about to go camping, with a folksy demeanor that disguised the fact that he could dismantle legal arguments the way a mechanic dismantles engines. They read the lawsuit. Then they read it again. Then Sandra started laughing so hard, she had to put down her coffee before she choked on it. "Oh my God," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Oh my God, they actually filed this. They put their names on this document and filed it with an actual court." Marcus was grinning like he'd just been told Christmas was coming early. "This is the best thing I've read since that lawsuit where a guy tried to sue himself for emotional distress. Do they not have competent legal counsel? Did they let an intern write this? Can we countersue for wasting everyone's time?" I asked, only half joking. "We could," Sandra said, still giggling. "But honestly, this is going to fall apart so fast that it'll probably be dismissed before we even need to file a substantive response." They're claiming you stole your own work. You have time-stamped code commits, patent applications with your name on them filed before they claimed ownership, email chains proving you developed everything independently. This isn't just a weak case. This is corporate suicide by litigation. She was right. The lawsuit died a slow, embarrassing death over the next 3 weeks as our legal team filed motion after motion that basically said, "Have you actually looked at the evidence?" in increasingly formal language. Neuralink's lawyers started sending settlement feelers, which is what happens when attorneys realize they've been handed a dumpster fire and told to make it look like a controlled burn. But before the lawsuit could officially implode, I got a phone call that made everything significantly more interesting. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, which usually meant spam about my car's extended warranty or someone who wanted to discuss my internet service provider options. But this time it was Preston Ward, the company chairman of Neuralink, the big boss. The guy who sat on the board and made decisions that affected thousands of employees while probably playing golf 3 times a week and attending charity galas where he pretended to care about social causes. Preston Ward was old money with new tech investments. The kind of guy who wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary and had that peculiar accent that rich people develop when they've spent too much time around other rich people and forgotten how normal humans talk. He'd probably never written a line of code in his life, but he was very good at understanding when something threatened his investment portfolio. "I'd like to discuss a business proposition," Preston said after minimal pleasantries, his voice smooth like expensive whiskey and probably just as likely to give you a headache. "I think we can resolve this situation in a way that benefits everyone involved." "You mean the lawsuit where your company is claiming I stole my own work?" I asked, putting him on speaker so I could continue working while we talked. "That situation? Let's be civil," he said, which is what rich people say when they want you to forget they're trying to screw you over. "Legal disputes are expensive and time-consuming for everyone. I'd like to propose an alternative." "I'm listening," I said, mostly because I was curious about what kind of offer would come from the chairman himself instead of being filtered through layers of management and legal departments. "We want to buy 40% of Neuroforge," he said, just dropping it out there like he was offering to buy me lunch instead of proposing to purchase a significant chunk of my company. "We'll pay fair market value, provide resources for scaling, give you access to our distribution channels and client base. You continue running operations. We provide strategic support. Everyone wins." I stopped typing, stared at my computer screen, tried to process what I'd just heard. They were suing me for stealing from them and simultaneously trying to buy a piece of my company. It was the corporate equivalent of punching someone in the face and then asking if they wanted to be business partners, except with more legal paperwork and fewer visible bruises. "Let me get this straight," I said slowly. "You're currently suing me, claiming that everything I've built belongs to you. And you're also trying to buy part of it? Do you see how those two things contradict each other?" "The lawsuit is a formality," Preston said, waving away the 63-page legal document like it was a minor inconvenience instead of a direct attack on my livelihood. "Business is business. But I'm offering you an opportunity here. Access to resources you can't get anywhere else, connections that take decades to build, institutional knowledge that money can't buy. You already tried buying 15 years of my marriage," I said, thinking about Melissa and Landon and all the business trips that were definitely not just business. That didn't work out so well either. There was a pause, the kind of silence that suggested I'd said something unexpected or possibly said the quiet part out loud that was supposed to stay quiet. Then Preston laughed, a calculated laugh that rich people use when they're pretending something is funny instead of uncomfortable. "I like you," he said, which was almost certainly a lie. "You've got backbone. That's rare in this industry. Most people roll over the second someone with money shows up. But let's be realistic. You're building something impressive with Neuroforge, but you'll need us eventually. Everyone needs infrastructure, distribution, credibility. We can provide all of that." "Maybe," I said, watching my team through the glass partition working on our next project. Claire redesigning an interface, Ravi optimizing database queries, Jules debugging front-end code. "But not before you check your email again." Another pause. Longer this time. "Excuse me. Check your email, Preston. Should be hitting your inbox right about now." I'd been prepared for this call, or something like it, because rich guys like Preston don't make moves without telegraphing them first. So I'd asked Sandra and Marcus to prepare a little present, a detailed analysis of Neuralink's lawsuit showing exactly how it would fail, combined with documentation of my independent development work, sprinkled with references to anti-SLAPP statutes and potential countersuits for malicious prosecution. I'd CC'd every board member whose email I could find, plus a few tech journalists who specialized in corporate malfeasance, just to make sure everyone understood that this wasn't a negotiation. This was me drawing a line in the sand and daring them to cross it. "You're making a mistake," Preston said, his voice losing that smooth quality and gaining an edge that suggested he wasn't used to people telling him no. "Pride is expensive in this business. You could have our support, our resources, our network. Instead, you're choosing to make an enemy." "I'm not making an enemy," I corrected him. "I'm just refusing to reward people who thought I was disposable. There's a difference." He hung up without saying goodbye, which was fine because I'd already said everything I needed to say. 2 weeks later, the lawsuit vanished quietly, like a bad tweet getting deleted after everyone's already screenshotted it. Neuralink issued a statement about mutual resolution of business differences that didn't admit wrongdoing but also didn't claim victory, which in legal terms meant they'd gotten destroyed and were trying to make it sound like a draw. Sandra called me the day the dismissal went through. "They folded faster than origami at a Japanese restaurant," she said, clearly pleased with herself. "Dropped everything, agreed to pay your legal fees, and included a non-disparagement clause that goes both ways, which means they can't talk trash about you and you can't talk trash about them." "Does it count as trash talk if it's just factually accurate descriptions of what happened?" I asked. "Legally ambiguous, morally satisfying," she said. "My favorite category." That night, I sat in the Neuroforge office after everyone had gone home, looking at our wall of whiteboards covered in diagrams and code snippets and project timelines. We'd survived a lawsuit from a company with infinite resources. We'd turned down an acquisition offer from people who thought money could solve any problem. We'd built something that mattered without compromising or selling out or accepting that invisibility was the price of employment. And we were just getting started. A year later, I was standing on stage at the International Tech Conference in Austin, wearing jeans and a blazer because suits are for people who peaked in corporate America, and I was officially done with that life. The auditorium was packed with about 2,000 tech professionals who'd paid ridiculous amounts of money to hear people talk about innovation while secretly checking their phones and wondering if the conference center Wi-Fi would actually work. I opened with the line I'd been practicing for weeks. "So, I wasn't on the list last year." The crowd laughed, not because they knew my story, but because everyone in tech has been excluded from something, and the shared trauma created instant connection. I told them about building Neuroforge, about hiring people who'd been overlooked, about creating something that mattered instead of just something that looked good in press releases. I talked about how the best revenge isn't destruction, it's construction, building something so undeniably good that the people who dismissed you have to watch it succeed without them. From the stage, I could see Melissa sitting in the third row next to Landon, both of them looking like they'd accidentally wandered into their own intervention. They looked smaller somehow, diminished, like characters from a story I'd finished reading and moved past. I ended my talk with, "Sometimes you don't need a seat at their table. You just need better Wi-Fi and a sense of humor." Standing ovation. The kind that makes you realize you're not invisible anymore. You're unforgettable. Afterward, Melissa sent a text. "I'm sorry. You were right. If you ever need someone to talk to." I replied with 2 words that had become my signature move. My mic drop, my way of closing chapters that deserved to stay closed. Check your email. Except this time, the email was empty, because I had nothing left to say to people who'd already heard everything that mattered.